It would be on.
Right.
Okay, so what we're just waiting for the YouTube to be live.
Now I feel I need to buy a red light for the room.
No, you don't. I'll start calling you Roxanne.
Oh,
Well, getting.
It would be on. Right.
right. That's an issue. There we go.
And I've muted the YouTube stream because that was going to get incredibly confusing and loud.
Listening to ourselves talk back to ourselves.
Yeah.
Yes.
30 seconds later.
Right, we are live. Hello to everyone on YouTube, and Scarbs is with us. You can probably see the virtual Scarbs at the end of the podcast table.
Looking slightly more animated than I normally do.
Looking very surprised.
Well, you're threatening him with a microphone that's about twice the size of his head. What do you expect?
That is surprising.
Right.
We got the YouTube up and running. Should we prepare for the
YouTube,
start of the
YouTube
show?
is running. I
YouTube
think
is
we
up and
are we are more or less good to go. I'll just
He's gonna
One
make
last
some
vape.
Noise. Vape noise.
God, that is a luxurious
Very
cloud
atmospheric.
right there.
Oh dear.
Are we ready?
Right, and yeah, I think we are ready to go. I'm just going to switch off from the YouTube window so I don't see the comments. Right, Lee, ready when you are. Hi, and welcome to this week's 3Legs4Wheels F1 podcast. It's Paul here with,
Sean.
Chris.
Lee.
and our special guest this week, Craig Scarborough. Welcome along, Craig.
Thank you for welcoming me back. Excellent. Good to see you all guys.
Wouldn't be the start of the season without you because we need to know basically what the hell we're going to be watching racing this year. I'm just taking it that we are going to be watching some racing, coronavirus discussion out the window.
Yes.
For now.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the cars are all looking very similar this year, which I think was kind of what we expected. A couple of them looking rather more similar to some other cars than perhaps we were predicting. But that's the Racing Point story at some stage. But yeah, already we can see there's sort of 3 or 4 really quite interesting technical things going on. Plus the sort of the Ferrari fuel saga rolling on again into the new year. So yeah, there's lots to get quite excited about on the cars themselves. Yeah, which probably is just as well because it might just be talking about cars sitting still. That's all we get to talk about this year.
Well, fingers crossed we actually will get a race in Australia, although Lee had a bold prediction about this.
My bold prediction is that Australia will be called off within 24 hours.
Okay. All right. Well, I think with people on these long-haul flights at the moment suffering coughing, as Lewis Hamilton described it on his tweet, yeah, they're probably going to really regret that, aren't they?
I'm not saying people are going to be happy about it.
But yeah, we'll start with what the cars look like this year, and I mean, I don't know which way to go first.
Well, the big story of the winter.
DAS, the
Yeah.
Ferrari, or the pink Mercedes.
DAS has got to be
Yes.
the first.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite an interesting one, wasn't it? It was something completely left field, kind of attacked us on the first day of testing. I can actually, I remember it as if it was yesterday, when it was actually only 6 testing days ago. But yeah, someone said, "Oh, what's Hamilton doing with his wheel?" And it's like, I don't know. What do you
Turning
mean?
it.
It's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And immediately jumped in my car and did a video pulling my steering wheel backwards and forwards. So yeah, this whole steering thing with Mercedes has kind of opened another area which people haven't spoken about for ages, which is sort of toe in, toe out on the front wheels, or tracking as you call it on your road car. And Mercedes have found this steering rack system where you, on the straights, you pull the steering wheel back as though you were trying to get an aircraft to take off. And in doing that, it adjusts something inside the steering rack, and the wheels go from pointing outwards slightly, which is called toe out, to pointing, I suspect, probably more almost in a parallel position. And of course, we've all been scratching our heads to understand exactly why this is. And when you even hear people like Adrian Newey going, "Well, I just don't understand it. It's not an aero thing. Why would they be doing this?" It kind of makes you realise that this is something quite different, and the regulations aren't geared up for people playing about with adjustable toe around the circuit. So yeah, so it's turned into quite a nice little kind of area for us to kind of look into. So to explain initially, no car would normally have its steering with the both front wheels pointed in exactly the same direction. They always have a little degree of toe out or toe in on road cars. It's for a little bit of stability under braking. In a race car, you have a bit of toe out, and that just helps with the turning into corners to sort of manage the balance of the car as you get that initial turn in. But the problem that creates is if your wheels are pointing out slightly, and you could imagine if you really kind of exaggerated that, along the straights, it means your tyres are both trying to steer the car in different directions, which means the tyres are actually scrubbing along the circuit. And that means that they're slowing the car down because of the friction, and it also means that they're slightly less aerodynamic because they're odd shape because they're pointing outwards. Um, and what Mercedes have chosen to do with the system is to make the wheels point in line, parallel to each other along the straights. And I think the consensus of opinion now it's not because of the drag of the tyre on the circuit. It's not because of the aerodynamic drag or any other influence like that. It's actually to do with tyre cooling. So at some circuits, your front tyres will be running way too hot. So if you could cool them on the straights, that means you could get more life out of a set of tyres, and you can keep them in their temperature window, which means you get better lap times as well. So I think this whole DAS thing is really all about race tyre management. They could potentially use it in qualifying, but I think the impact would be much less. So in the race, if Bono comes onto the radio to Lewis and say your front tyres are getting hot, let's use DAS for a few laps. So on the straights, he'll just pull the steering wheel back, and it will just bring the front tyre temperatures down into a manageable level. So this is kind of just a really weird workaround for the bizarre tyres that F1 chooses to mandate Pirelli to make every year with these kind of high temperature, high degradation, very temperature sensitive tyres. So DAS really is a kind of a developmental dead end that would never probably be seen anywhere else other than current F1 with the regulations and with the tyres that we've got. Um, so it's a bit of an advantage for Mercedes, who have worked very hard to manage their tyre temperatures over the past few years. It's always been something they struggle with. So we now have to sort of scratch our heads and go, well, is it legal? As far as I can see, I can't think of a real argument that would make DAS illegal because it's steering and not suspension. So it's subject to slightly different regulations. And while when you pull DAS into operation and it affects the wheel, so it's adjusting the suspension via secondary effect and it's adjusting the aero via secondary effect. But then so does steering in any corner anyway. So, it's not an argument you can say that it's having an effect on aero or suspension. So really the only arguments would be if there's some argument about setup between qualifying and the race. If you don't use DAS in quali and you use it in the race, then you're doing something in Parc Ferme that effectively is a bit iffy. But I really think that's kind of stretching it a bit. I think most teams will just think we're not going to waste our money arguing about this or even developing our own one. I think Ferrari and Red Bull are probably keeping a little eye on what their tyre temperatures look like in Barcelona testing, and would then decide, do we want to develop this? Is it going to be something that we can get some benefit from, or should we just kind of let it run and ignore it? And I think the majority of teams actually won't try and replicate DAS, and it's banned for 2021 already. So it's just going to be one of those oddball things that one team's run in a single year, and in a few years' time, we'll all kind of forget about it.
I suppose with 2021 being such a big change as well, the idea of developing a system like that, like over the next 6 months, has just taken time away from next year too.
Exactly, and if you think that the people looking after suspension and steering have got to cope with the 18-inch wheels and the skinny tyres, they've got enough to be working on than trying to play sort of silly games with toe control on the straights. So even though, as I say, the FIA have known about this for well over a year and they've already written in regulations to ban it. Although I wonder if some of the teams may, in the future, see if they can kind of circumvent them rules to reintroduce something like this if the tyres do need that level of management in a race. But again, I think most people have got sort of bigger fish to fry, and they'll just leave DAS on the shelf.
Yeah, I just wonder because I think from what I read, the rules for next year, it's all about controlling it via the steering wheel, and the rules just state that the steering wheel can only move on a horizontal axis. So if other teams do bring in a system, then they'd have to use a lever control on the steering wheel or
Yeah, and I mean, look,
something extra, which wouldn't be illegal under what I understand.
yeah,
The
I
rules are.
mean, there are, you know, it's very hard to think of a way around that change in regulation, because the beauty of the system is in the fact that you're moving the steering wheel. And of course, you're allowed to move the steering wheel, maybe not in that axis, but no one's ever thought about that in the past before. So yeah, it does really quite tightly pin down what teams are doing with you know, the what they call the toe curve. So how the tyres change, the front tyres change their angle relative to each other on straights and around corners. Now there are ways you can already do that. We're seeing a lot of teams playing around with Ackerman now, which is the suspension geometry of how the steering relates to the steering pivot axis on the wheels. And you could arguably create a car that already had parallel steering for the straights and then toe out for the corners, and that's quite possible. And I think Red Bull are one of the teams that are probably going that path. But the only benefit that they don't have over the Mercedes DAS system is that that will be on all the time. So in a race, if you suddenly find your tyres are getting hot or cold, you can't change it. You'll always have that fixed toe control. So the beauty of DAS is that, you know, the drivers can choose to use it or not, depending on what the tyres are doing in a race. So, you know, again, I think we'll probably find more interesting conversations talking about Ackerman, which is a massively complicated and very hard to explain, particularly without drawings, which makes this podcast quite difficult. And I
Paint a
can't be
picture with
waving
your
my,
words.
I'm actually waving my hands frantically around here, pointing at what wheels look like when they move. But you can't see any of that, unfortunately, on this stream tonight. But yeah, I mean, I think how they play about with suspension geometry is another one of those areas which people are starting to get back involved with. We saw a little bit of it last year with a couple of teams, which, funny enough, included Mercedes and probably, funny enough, Racing Point as well, and Williams and a couple of things played with it. But I think this year, although we haven't seen the cars obviously stripped of all their bodywork yet, but certainly what Red Bull have done with this double bulkhead is largely based around the steering and toe control for the front wheels and things like Ackerman and what have you.
How effective do you expect DAS to actually be, or is it just a completely unknown quantity when it comes to in terms of lap time? If, as you say, Bono gets on the radio to Lewis and says, right, let's use DAS, do you think it'll be an actual...
It's one of those things that's very hard to pinpoint down to a bit of time, because it wouldn't give, if you were already doing a lap time, using DAS wouldn't, with everything else being equal, actually make you go quicker. I mean, it may be a tiny fraction quicker, but not to the point where the amount of development they've put into it will be worth it. Where it will gain its time will be in race tyre strategy. So if they can keep their tyres within the working temperature, rather than getting them too hot, then that means the drivers can go quicker because the tyres are working better. But again, no quicker than they would be before, but quicker than they would be if they were overheating, if you see what I mean.
Quicker for longer.
Likewise, range much better by using DAS strategically through the race when the tyres get hot or cold. That means that they potentially could run stints to be a little bit longer than their rivals could if they were having similar problems. So the game would be maybe an extra lap on a stint, or maximising your lap time through a stint because you've always got the tyres in the right temperature window. So that's where the gain is. It's maximising your maximum performance rather than actually making you go faster than you would have before. So it's hard to predict. There's some circuits that it won't give you any benefit whatsoever because it's normally the rear tyres that are the problem. It will just be ones which are really stressing the front tyres, which would tend to be some of these high load circuits, Barcelona, Silverstone, all the ones where we had the funny tyres a couple of years ago where front tyres get really heavily loaded through the high downforce corners. They'll probably be the ones that will be important. So probably for maybe, let's assume in every race goes ahead, they'll probably only use it maybe at half of the races, unless the tyres really start to be a problem for them this year.
Could you theoretically use it the other way around, where if you're behind a safety car or in a VSC, where you could add toe to help the tyres keep up to temperature?
you could rejig the system, but the system will only work one way or the other. It'll either increase the amount of toe outwards or it will increase the amount of toe inwards. So you would have to decide which geometry rack you would have before a race. So if in the situation I've explained where you would have normal tyre temperature and then you would then employ DAS to reduce tyre temperature, you could potentially have another steering rack set up where you have normal tyre temperature, but then DAS on the straights actually gives you more toe out to increase tyre temperature even further.
Somewhere like Monaco, where it's
Yeah, I mean,
easy on
that would be,
tyres
yeah,
and
that would
you're
be,
going to get a safety car.
yeah, I mean, it'd be a pretty bold step to actually create a system that would give you even more front tyre temperature. But again, maybe they've got two geometries and they can fit the rack depending on the situation. You know, we're all kind of guessing here because we've got nothing to kind of look back on. I mean, I can't think of a single situation where a race car has employed a variable toe system. Not even during the active era did anyone think about doing that. There are some sort of road car systems and some sort of development systems and you know, ProDriver company I do a bit of work for have actually produced something like that for just kind of, you know, a testing sort of function. So we've got nothing to kind of look back on in this respect, and it's not a variable that anyone's really put into race strategies before. So at the moment, the only version we've seen is where it decreases the amount of toe, so the wheels are pointing more straight than pointed outwards. So we would have to assume that's the system that they intend to run. But as I say, you're right, they could have a tyre warming version, which is does the opposite.
It's nice that Formula One can still surprise, isn't it?
It is, you know, and you have to wonder how some of these meetings came about. It's like, oh God, if only we could do this to get more tyre temperature. And someone says, well, why don't we try this? It's like, that's mad. But sometimes it's those ideas that you know get progressed. And if you look at the regulations for steering, it is literally about 3 or 4 points, which is pretty much that you can only steer 2 wheels with the steering wheel. I mean, I think that's the kind of the gist of it, really. So yeah, it's one of those areas that's never really been developed, and no one's thought to have rules to kind of circumvent it. A bit like the F duct a few years ago, and, you know, other these kind of the big stories that we've had over the years on technology as well.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what they do with it and where they use it. And I think we're going to see it quite a bit just because of the way that Mercedes were playing it down after everyone discovered what it was.
Yes, and I think for me the interesting thing would be if anyone feels it's worth punting in a little protest. It's the first time it's used. One of the kind of the vaguer things that it kind of conflicted with. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, again, I think whether it runs or whether it gets banned, I don't think it overall in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be a silver bullet that's going to decide. I mean, it's not a double diffuser kind of advantage. It's something that Mercedes have clearly been struggling with, thought to find a solution, and it may make them a bit more consistent throughout the season. In different weathers and different circuits, but that's about as far as it goes.
Let's face it, Ferrari would be the one that probably would put the complaint in, and they're probably going to keep quiet for a while, I'd imagine.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Renault like a good bit of a complaint, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you always hear exactly who does protest, and certainly when I've had the sort of the inside story on protest, it's not the team that are actually doing the protesting or being blamed in the media for protesting that actually do it. Normally, it's either people moaning about Ferrari or people moaning that Ferrari are protesting. So yeah, I wouldn't take too much heed of any media stories around who would protest if it does come about.
You never know. We might get the second ever 17 press release about a protest in the history of F1. The first one, of course, coming last week after every non-Ferrari powered team said, "Hang on a minute, why aren't you giving us the full story here?"
Yeah, that. I mean, this is a story that's been kind of rumbling for a couple of years. Obviously, we had the double battery argument a couple of seasons ago, I think it was now. that never really kind of got openly resolved or clarified exactly what was going on or what's changed in order to keep an eye on it. Now we have everyone moaning that Ferrari's engine has been too good this year, when for years we've been moaning that, or not moaning that the Mercedes has been too good, whereas Mercedes were lauded for having a great engine. Ferrari, well, it must be illegal, there must be something wrong with this engine. So the story basically is that since 2014, all of the F1 engines have got a limited fuel flow. So at any point, you can't have more than an instantaneous rate of fuel going out of the fuel tank and into the engine. And there's been lots of ruses over the years to try and store fuel outside of the fuel tank around the engine and bits and pieces like that. But that's all been kind of strapped down. Obviously, all the oil burning story, which, again, you could argue about its legality, and Mercedes were the people that introduced that into what they call party mode into F1 a couple of years ago. So where it's got to now is that the people on the other manufacturer engine teams think, well, the only way Ferrari could be having such a powerful engine is somehow that they can beat the fuel flow meter. Now, the fuel flow meter sits inside the fuel tank, and it's a purely electronic system. There's no moving parts in it, and it measures the fuel going through by ultrasonic means, which is not something I care to try to explain how it works. Mainly, not simply because I'm not on video and I can't wave my hands around enough, but frankly because I don't know how it works. But the argument is that somehow Ferrari are interfering with the signal from this sensor that goes back into the FIA data recorder, which is built into the car. Now, that could well be the case. And we don't know if other teams have already been doing that. But obviously, the FIA have spent a lot of time last year looking at Ferrari. And we had this really strange series of press releases from the FIA saying, well, effectively, we can't prove that they have cheated, but we aren't happy that what they've got is exactly what we wanted within the regulations. So we've agreed with Ferrari to make some changes and leave it at that. When this goes on all of the time in Formula One, with people putting ideas forward to the FIA saying, yes, that's legal, or no, we're not happy, or teams pointing out designs to the FIA on other people's cars and the FIA having a quiet word. Often, most technical controversies get solved this way. For some reason, the FIA's way that they dealt with the press releases inflamed all these other teams, and they've now put this kind of big, oh, we're not happy about this kind of thing. So, where does that go now? The FIA clearly can't prove Ferrari have cheated. They can't prove that their system is in contravention of the regulations, so they can't take Ferrari to court over anything. They can't, have a big argument with them, because it would just run on in court and it would just cost everyone a huge amount of money and not really ever get to a clear resolution, I would imagine. So where does that leave all the other teams? Obviously, Red Bull are claiming that they're going to sue FIA for the loss of their prize money, because they would have come second if Ferrari hadn't been doing whatever they were doing. So on the political side, I've got no idea where that's going to go. However, the FIA have already acted upon what Ferrari or other teams, let's be quite clear, because it's very easy to point the finger straight at Ferrari, but the FIA did investigate other people's fuel systems through the year as well. So there's no, there could be fingers pointed in other directions as well. But what they've done is they've actually fitted a second fuel flow meter. So this first one will be now described as the team's flow meter, and the teams can take the data off of that to make sure that they're not flowing too much fuel. But now there's a second, very similar fuel flow meter provided by one of the homologated suppliers, Centronics. But this now has got a completely encrypted data recording capacity, and that goes straight to the FIA data recorder. So the teams can't hack into what that fuel flow meter is saying. So even if they're cheating the first one, they've got no idea what the FIA meter is measuring. So that effectively means that you've got a completely clean signal for the FIA to measure. So the first theory on that one is that it should stop teams then doing whatever they may have been doing in cheating the meter, which is great. It means everyone's using the same level of fuel flow, and we're back to a level playing field, which is great. But then well, I mean, if you remember when that meter came in, I think Mark Webber lost his finish at the first Grand Prix of 2014 because of a fuel flow meter error.
Was it
So
not
if the
Ricardo at that point?
was it sorry, no, I think that was Webber back then, 2014. It would have been sort of multi 21 era, wasn't it? Yeah, was that right? Or
I think Ricardo has lost a podium in Australia as well, maybe. Because
oh, right,
Sure
okay.
it was.
was it his first race in Red Bull?
It was.
I can't remember. Who cares
Some
about drivers?
Australian.
They're vehicle operators. They're not really important in this situation. But it does worry is if the team are reading their meter and they feel that by reading that data that they've got the right fuel flow level, if that for some reason doesn't correlate to what the FIA are getting from their meter, where does the argument go then? Now, I've got no reason to think that that will happen because obviously this has all been, sort of rig tested and there's lots of transparency about how this is all set up with the teams. But, I suppose there is always some potential for something to go wrong somewhere. But I think, again, the key thing there is that the FIA have acted upon this. They've found a system and they've actually found a way which could actually be employed in other areas of the car to double check legality, where they're using the same sensors as the teams are using for their own telemetry to do the policing of the car. So again, this is another good step for the FIA in actually policing the teams on the electronics. So we'll just see how this shakes out of the first few races.
Yeah, this of course is totally coincidental with Ferrari's testing speed traps being well down on where they thought they would be, and where in comparison to where they were even last year.
Yes, I mean Ferrari's pace, I think, is going to be one of the puzzling questions over the start of this season. To be honest, kind of away from the controversies. You can see that Mercedes are fast. I mean, that comes as no surprise to anybody. Red Bull have had that momentum they built up through last year, so they're looking really strong. Ferrari are taking a step back, and Ferrari as a team, and from the people that I've kind of heard whispers from within the team, they're not happy internally with the performance of their car. Now, some of that you can point at the engine. Some of that is that they had to change their philosophy from last year, which was this low drag, low downforce setup, which kind of ruined their tyre management, and really the straight line speed advantage wasn't enough to beat Mercedes over a lap the majority of the time anyway. So they've lost straight line speed from a concept change in the car, but equally the whispers we're getting out of kind of Maranello is that this car isn't performing and wasn't hitting its targets in the way that they wanted to. So Ferrari can actually slip away from being that kind of, third equal top team to maybe dropping slightly behind Mercedes and Red Bull and into the clutches of, dare say it, McLaren or even from Racing Point.
Have you been?
You have to add. So yeah, that's going to be a really interesting dynamic in the early part of the season. Now, no doubt Ferrari will claw it back, and no doubt there'll be some race weekends where that Ferrari package, because of its set up, the way it works on the tyres on one weekend and the weather will work and they'll get victories. But at the moment, it's not looking really very optimistic in the early part of the season for Ferrari, not least if you then start to think about all of the problems that they will have with their personnel back home, and the travelling personnel going out to races from Italy at the moment.
Even supply chain of getting updates out to the team might be a struggle.
It's obviously Ferrari being based in that area, as the same area as Magneti Marelli, as Dallara with Haas. There's a real, but much like you have in the UK, it's a real area of motorsport excellence, and if that is interrupted and the ability to get people to places and goods and equipment to places, it could play out quite badly for the the Italian-based teams. Obviously, Toro Rosso being included in that as well. So things are kind of just piling on top of Ferrari at the moment, and I think it's for F1 that they are competitive. So it's always a bit of a worry when you see lots of these sort of warning signs that they're not going to be kind of there or thereabouts this year.
I can't help but think that Italy could be like in the middle of a zombie apocalypse, but the government would still somehow find a way for Ferrari to race.
Yeah, there is always that aspect, and I hate to be sort of stereotypical about how things run in different countries, but yeah, there's rules and there's rules, and they can be applied in slightly different ways depending on where the influence is. So, but fingers crossed for Ferrari that they can keep that pressure on Mercedes and against Red Bull, because I think that will make for a fascinating season, if only to see how the pressure of trying to get success at Ferrari plays out between the two drivers, because I think that potentially is the potentially a triple bill of Drive to Survive season 3. So much to focus on between the two Ferrari drivers this year that they'll just have to maybe run an entire season about it.
That'll obviously run at the same time as the new spin-off Gunter Steiner series.
Which has to happen.
We need that.
Just do a chat show at the end of the Grand Prix, doesn't he? Just bring people in, shout.
If there was ever a team principal we needed to get on this podcast, it's him.
Yeah.
He has turned into a legend, hasn't he? Absolutely. The funny thing is I've dealt with Gunter going all the way back almost to the Jaguar years, and I can't actually remember him chatting to him where he's actually sworn that. I can listen to my transcripts, but he never came across to me as someone so sweary. But my God, does he swear on the show? But I think that's one of the things that maybe often F1 gets lost in the PR correctness, and that has kind of Drive to Survive, for all of its faults and for all of the faults of the other broadcasters covering the Grand Prix each weekend, the Drive to Survive has kind of brought that out, which I think is great.
He does have a Roman Grosjean and a Kevin Magnussen now since Jaguar.
Maybe it's Grosjean that's brought it out of it.
It has, and it's like you've still got the same drivers again.
It's amazing. After watching that episode on Haas, I'm still none the wiser at how at least one of them isn't there.
But equally, the drivers want to stay there as well.
Well, yeah. Well, to be fair, I think Haas might have more choice than they do.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. But it has showed how a very difficult year played out for them. They had it coming at them from all directions last year. So, I don't think testing has really proved conclusively quite where Haas are placed this year, I don't think.
In the gravel.
In the gravel, I mean, they don't feel like they've jumped up to the sharp end, but then again, it's not about the sheer pace of the car. It was about how they cope with the tyres and how they cope with problems with their aero correlation. So, again, that's one of those stories that I think is going to play out over the entire year to see where Haas come back to. But, again, that midfield pack is looking even tighter this year and even closer to the top 3. So, it's going to be really cutthroat there this year.
And we did a poll on our Twitter account a couple of weeks ago about, is this going to be Haas's last season in F1? And the results actually came out 50-50, so nobody's entirely convinced. And I personally can't see all the issues that they had last season with the car improving, because I'm right in thinking that we're running the same spec tyres this year as we were in 2019.
They are, yes.
And Haas are still buying a car off the shelf.
Well,
In bits
yes.
from a variety of different parts suppliers.
Well, mainly from Ferrari. Yeah. If Ferrari buy it from another supplier, then Haas in turn buy it. But effectively, they're buying the Ferrari non-listed parts to build up the rest of the car around the bits that they have to make to be a constructor. So nothing has really changed in their approach to the sport this year. I think the regulation has changed on they have to design their own brake ducts this year. But to be honest, with the problems that they were having with tyre temperature, that is no bad thing that they would probably even started doing that last year. So, I mean, but last year, the problem with the tyres was one issue, but also they did have an aero correlation issue, which I've not really had a chance to discuss with the team directly, but certainly from kind of reading some non-technical interviews around it, it was basically some airflow wasn't going with the way it was as they updated the parts, and they didn't pick up on that. So they actually had a car that aero was screwing itself up around the lap in certain conditions, and only adding to obviously the other woes that they had. So if they've got the aero bit sorted out, then potentially the tyre problem could improve for them, and they can make progress. If they haven't done that, then obviously things will look really bad for them this year. And in terms of that vote, I'd like to see Haas stay on in F1. But equally, I could understand why Gene Haas has kind of given it a go, hasn't had the budget to kind of build the team forwards in the way that they have, and going the listed parts approach, which they've done, was only ever a way to get the team up to speed quickly, not a long-term solution, because you can't just, buy another team's parts and then build your car around it, because you need to understand every aspect of your car if you're going to work up the grid. If you've got loads of bits that you kind of just get given and you have to then work out, because obviously Ferrari can't sit there and baby talk Haas through, because the regulations, not because Ferrari wouldn't want to. They can't baby talk Haas through, well, we've designed it like this to do this, so you're going to have to do this as well. It's kind of like, well, this is what these parts look like, go away and build your own Lego kit out of it. So it's, it was only ever a short-term thing. So if they want to step forwards and become a successful F1 team, they would need to become a proper constructor, making more and more of the car, and that just needs more and more money. And I don't know if that's what Gene Haas wants to invest his money in going forwards, when there are, lots of other alternatives around the world for getting exposure for your machine tools.
They had a couple of sessions in testing as well where they had technical issues. They probably spent a bit more time in the garage than some of the others. How is that going to affect them?
I mean, I think that's all part and parcel of sort of testing. You lose time. Only 6 days this year really was kind of reducing it down to an absolute minimum. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, but you adjust your program to make sure you get the priority stuff done. Until you get to a proper hot race in proper race conditions, it's very hard. Barcelona's a great track to test at, but it is notoriously difficult to actually get real judgments from how tyres will behave in real hot temperatures. So I think they'll be happy actually just to get racing and start to develop from there, rather than worrying too much about losing a couple of days of testing or whatever the accumulated time was that they lost during the test.
Yeah, 'cause I think K-Mag ended up with the least amount of laps on the Friday afternoon, because he spent most of the final session in the garage getting the clutch put back together.
Yeah, and again, I think lots of the other teams actually also had some, mechanical issues based around the engines, in particular Mercedes, unusually losing time for both the factory car and I think the Williams, wasn't it? Which is quite unusual. So everyone is pushing really hard. So you will get problems like this, but with only 6 days of testing it, in some respects, it's kind of like, well, you haven't lost that much. Because there was so little to start with. You're just, you're always going to be time starved through testing. So, let's get out to some nice hot races and just get the car running.
Well, you mentioned Williams. Is their improvement sort of a bit of a false dawn, or do they appear to try and join the rest of the teams now?
I wish I could answer that honestly, because I haven't got the answer. The signs look good, that they are progressing. They are still towards the back, I think it's fair to say, but I think they could be battling at the back with a couple of other teams, rather than being the real outliers, particularly in qualifying. I think in the race last year, I think lots of people kind of fell backwards into their clutches because of issues rather than because of sheer car performance. So I'm not sure if I've seen enough from Williams publicly stating where they're at to kind of feel that they've made a huge jump forwards. I think they have made progress. They obviously had lots of issues last year, and they appear to have gone through trying to tackle them. But they're coming from a very long way back. The car doesn't look massively different. You know, they haven't kind of found a couple of silver bullets in the design of the car that makes you think, wow, they're really kind of back on the story. Because to be honest, if you'd have looked at last year's Williams and painted it silver and called it Mercedes, most people would look at some of the features on it and thought, wow, that's really cool. That's going to be a fast car. But, you know, it's in the detail, and it's the ability of the team to execute the problems. And again, Drive to Survive, I think really didn't delve deeply enough into what was actually going on at Williams at that stage, or the same time this year as it was last year at pre-season. I think it had a very light touch, and it was a very Williams-based point of view for that. So, yeah, I think Williams will do a bit better, but I think I don't think they've really got everything resolved that they need to get resolved within that team. So, you know, again, I fear for the future of the team as much as I fear for Haas. And, you know, I think it would be a huge issue if Williams can't continue in Formula One. I think Williams may well continue in some format. I think it could actually be absorbed by another entity or maybe go racing in another category going forwards. I don't know if Williams Formula One is necessarily the type what stay over the door going forwards.
This is the third season now, isn't it? The beginning of the third season, where we've heard the same kind of spiel, especially from the top brass at Williams, where they say, you know, last year was terrible, this year must be better, and you know,
Yes.
it's all well and good saying that, but you've got to make the changes.
But don't forget, in the words of Paddy Lowe, making a Formula One car these days is complicated.
Yes.
It is, especially if you can't make the parts quick enough. But yeah, that's a completely other story. Yes, it's you know, it's a really tough time, and I think if you look at Williams, you know, we've seen this with so many top teams that they've had periods of massive success, and then you kind of get that decline with a few spikes in it. So you know, obviously 2014 was a bit of a spike for them. The year Maldonado won that race, was that 2013?
2012.
2012,
Spain 2012, yeah.
God, is it that long
Yeah.
ago?
right. Yeah, there are a few spikes, but if you know 2014 that they got lots right with the change in the regulations, but since then it has been a decline, and you know it's a long way to dig yourself out of that when you see, you know, where the rest of the midfield have got to. You know, I know McLaren have been the team that have kind of done almost exactly that, but you don't get that sense of Williams fight back in the way that you've had perhaps with McLaren over the past few years.
Well, that's it. McLaren made the changes, didn't they? They made personnel changes. They made operational changes. They made philosophy changes, and it worked for them. And they're now further up the grid.
I think they've been quite open and honest with themselves along the way about where they've been going wrong, and I think that is, you know, it's kind of recovering from anything like, you know, like an addiction. You can't get over it until you admit that there's a problem, and you then start to tackle that. I think it's kind of where Williams is, and that I think, to me, that is the thing that worries me most about them going forwards, because everything they have done is right, but I still don't think that they've really kind of completely reversed their direction.
Do you think they'll look at what Racing Point have done this year and think maybe we should have gone down that road?
I think of all the teams, I think Williams would be the ones most resistant to doing that, in an odd kind of way, because Williams Grand Prix engineering. For them to then go ahead and take a listed parts approach would be, you know, the antithesis.
I mean, well, the Claire Williams quote from during testing: it would cost more to lay off the gearbox department than it would to buy in gearboxes.
Yeah, that's probably quite true. I mean, they've got, you know, that department in particular is a big part of Williams. But is that investment in those people? And I'm not picking the gearbox. I mean, any department, is that actually delivering lap time for that investment? I mean, that's really where Formula One management comes down to, is where do you spend your money to get your lap time? It's all very well and good and having some principles and, you know, a direction for the team, but at the end of the day, I think Dr. Harvey Postlethwaite, the old sort of Tyrrell boss, would say, you know, we're going to spend all our money on one area, forget about the front uprights. We don't want to make them any lighter this year because it's not really going to change the lap times. Let's focus our money on where you get lap time. And, maybe they do need to change their approach. But again, it would be very hard for Williams to do so when it's still, Frank and Claire's name over the door.
Yeah, I think the problem is as an organisation they've not modernised, and they've still got the attitude that even though they're in a big modern factory, they're still building cars in a shed.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's one way of putting it. It is, isn't it? It's still Frank's old team. Based down at over in Oxford, and it's again, the changes that potentially could need to be made don't appear to be being made. It's worrying because that you're not seeing these big names arriving at the door to make the big changes. You're not seeing people saying that we made any sort of big changes in that respect. So we just have to see where Williams get to. Fingers crossed that the car is working for them in the way they would want it to this year, even if it's not very fast. And if they understand it and it's working, then that is at least one step back on the road to getting in amongst the midfield.
Yeah, I mean, at least it turned up on time this year, so
Yeah.
that's that's one better than this time last year.
Yes, but you are very much look like they're starting with a car that was very much looked like the car from last year, and that there are changes on it, and obviously it is as I would describe it, never an accurate term, but 100% brand new car. But it's still very closely based on the ideas that they had last year, just with the problems hopefully ironed out in it. So yeah, they got testing. They've got 6 days. Let's see in Melbourne where they finish qualifying in on a even kind of fair day, and we can make some more judgments then, I think.
Now, the whole Racing Point thing, the pink Mercedes. How much of that is last year's Merc?
Right. Okay. So
The percentage has to start with a 9, by the way.
So I think here we've got to. I was writing an article about this the other day, and I had this great idea of how define what copy means. So I looked at the Oxford Dictionary, and it's like, oh God, no, that's not. I can't use that then. Right. So the Racing Point looks like last year's Mercedes. Okay.
Yeah.
So what that means is all the external surfaces have been very diligently copied from the ideas that Mercedes were running last year. That's not to say that they've got CAD data from Mercedes or parts that they could measure or anything like that, because obviously that's strictly against their regulations, and Racing Point aren't idiots. Mercedes certainly wouldn't be stupid enough to give away that sort of information, because it would obviously threaten their position in the championship. So Racing Point came to a decision last year, is that they developed the 2019 car up to a point mid-season where they had all the key bits and pieces on it that everybody else had, but they were still kind of middle of the midfield. Good days, bad days, but they were kind of the middle of the whole grid, really, weren't they? So they had to decide, we've got all this new money coming in, what do we do? Do we keep flogging the 2019 car, or do we do something radical, which is to try and do what Mercedes are doing? Because at the end of the day, the Mercedes is very different to everybody else's race car. It's a much longer wheelbase, it has much less rake, and it's been really successful, you have to say. I think it's fair to say Mercedes have been successful for the past 6 years.
They've not been
say so.
They've been all right.
And then you realise that Racing Point have run, obviously, not just the Mercedes power unit, but also the Mercedes gearbox. So for every year that they've been trying to run a slightly shorter, high-rake car, they've been lumbered with this big, long gearbox, which has got mounting points designed for a low-rake car, which makes it very difficult to then get all your rear suspension designed around it. So they made the quite wise choice, I think you would have to say, that we've got the Merc rear end, let's design a car that looks like the Merc, and we've got data for, well, obviously we've got photography of the 2019 car, we'll do that. So that's what they've done. There's no copying, literally copying from Mercedes. It's just been, look at the shapes they've got. We're now going to go and draw that ourselves, try and understand it ourselves, try and get the performance out of it, and make a new car that way. When you then look under the skin, you can actually then see is that the Racing Point is still a Racing Point. So the internal front suspension, the way they lay out the cooling, all the other bits under the skin that you can't see from the outside are all very much Racing Point for, as far as I can see. So you've got a car that has got a Mercedes-looking wrapper, but it hasn't got the Mercedes suite inside. It's got the Racing Point board suite inside rather than a German one. So
A
yeah,
word that's unoriginal.
yeah, I mean, there's lots of great jokes about the cut and pasting of the design. So, and I think testing has proven that has allowed them to make a jump in performance, but they may not have done if they'd just developed their car. But the problem then is this goes back to the kind of the Haas issue, the Racing Point, the listed parts issue, is that if they've copied someone else's work, do they really understand it? Now, they're not stupid, so I hope that they would have spent their work. Oh, you're still with me?
Yep, we're still here.
Oh, I'm very quiet. I heard some noise in the background. So just as Haas get a whole load of Ferrari stuff and don't necessarily understand it, Racing Point have got a whole load of stuff that they've copied from Mercedes, and they've tried to understand it, but in reality, when it hits the track at all these different race circuits, do they really, really understand it? So they could actually find themselves having a bit of a jump in performance, but then a bit of a slump as they then struggle to resolve the issues that they do have with the car, if there are any, and then work out how do they then develop that through the year, because obviously they've got no reference from Mercedes, because obviously Mercedes have completely changed their car this year, so they can't net mid-season cop 2020 Merc. They've got to try and second guess what Merc would have done if they'd have kept racing the 2019 car. So Racing Point have got a very difficult sort of period ahead of them. If there's no problem, then bang, they could be racing up against Powered and potentially kind of knocking up against some Ferraris and races. So they, it really pay off for them. But, you have to say the jury's out at this stage because there's so many potential risks involved with that approach.
So why this year? What like you say with them having the gearbox stuff like that over the course of the multiple years. Why this year?
I think the rationale for them was, and I think Andy Green was quite honest about this, he says, well, obviously, we know that the Strolls have put a huge amount of investment into Racing Point since they took over about, a year and a half ago now, isn't it? Mid-season 2018, I seem to remember. So for the first time, Racing Point, and whatever you want to call them as an entity over the years, the Silverstone-based team, you could call them, for the first time ever, they've actually got the money to actually make a wholly new car over the winter. And they've got the resources, because before that they were always a bit handicapped. Even last year's car was the 2018 monocoque that was revised to have different suspension and the different side pods. So they've always been restricted by resources. Now they haven't. They're thinking, well, actually, everyone else might be kind of just easing off the development for 2020 a little bit. So why don't we kind of, rather than do that, do the opposite, put our foot down, really develop a great car, reap the rewards early in 2020, hopefully in the championship, and then at some point, hopefully, we can then focus again onto 2021, big reg changes, and hopefully won't lose too much momentum for the season after this.
Because it was something that we've always said about Force India, is they always get better later on in the season, and if they've not got a 100% new car by Monza or Spa, they've usually got rid of all of last year's parts by that point. Which makes sense.
They always seem to be slightly out of phase with everybody else. Some years they start off really well because they had the money over the winter to develop a car, and then some years the money runs out mid-season and they can't develop the car mid-season. Sometimes they have the money mid-season and they can develop the car. So it never seems to follow a sort of a 12-monthly cycle. It seems to be almost like an 18-monthly cycle for them that puts them out of step with everyone else. I think now. And again, another one of the things people have said about that team over the years is, God, if only they were given a decent amount of money, imagine the job they could do, because they do so well with very little money. And, maybe the Strolls are having the effect there that they didn't have at Williams. and it's all kind of working out for them all, which I think at the end of the day, I think we'll all be really happy with. And Racing Point can go racing with the resources that they've always deserved.
I mean, from a sort of fans' perspective, it's good to see more teams actually there in the mix. What I'd like is a grid where every car looks different, because the teams have been able to do their own thing and can be competitive as well.
Yeah,
I can dream.
Yeah, I mean, really, this year, everyone is going to really converge on exactly the same ideas. Because by the end of the year, apart from some of the slight variations we've seen with the nose design, which, to be honest, isn't the most exciting thing to look at, is probably the only difference you'll be able to tell in the cars. Whether they've got, nostrils or a hole or a slim nose or a wide nose, that's about the only way you'll be able to tell them apart. Everywhere else now is very much cookie cutter. Even the front wings, by and large, are kind of converging on a mix of that inboard loaded, outboard loaded story that kind of brewed up last year. It's only looks like Sauber that have gone, Alfa Romeo have gone really extreme in another direction this year. And, they haven't got a lot to lose. They might as well just go and kind of, again, go their own direction. So the only car that does look different, funnily enough, is the Racing Point, because it looks like last year's Mercedes, which doesn't look like any of this year's cars. So,
Yeah.
despite cutting and pasting, they've actually ended up with a car that looks like no one else's, which seems ironic, really.
Yeah, there's nothing remarkable on any of the other cars, really, is there? If you look at the Renault, it looks a little bit different from last year. McLaren, same again. Obviously, the livery is a little bit different, but it doesn't look an awful lot different. The AlphaTauri, the old Toro Rosso team, they again new livery, but doesn't look that much different. If anything, that's the car that does look a little different, because I've noticed that the back end appears to be a lot slimmer even than the other cars that are on the grid. But I don't know if that's an optical illusion just because it's white.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, everyone's kind of following very much the same sideboard shape now, so it's very hard to kind of work out who is slimmer and who isn't. And even if they are, it's like kind of got to the stage now. It's like, so what? Everyone's got really slim. I think you're kind of split hairs by the end of it. So it's very hard to kind of pick the cars apart in terms of development. You go for a wide nose or a narrow nose or what have you. It's everyone's really using very much the same sort of solutions. It's just different ways of doing it, and they don't look that different. And it ends up being in the detail, which will split the teams. And I think in some respects, it almost potentially could come down to tyre management and how your car works in different weathers, different circuits, which we have seen a lot with in the midfield for the past few years. But I think they'll just be that little bit closer to the top three, if we can still call it that, over the course of the year. I don't think we've got to the stage where someone else could potentially come out and win a race outside of the top three on a normal weekend. I think if we have some unnormal weekends, like we had in sort of Germany last year, and what was the other cracker? Brazil. I think you could see certainly the podium being mixed up a lot this year, and I think then it could potentially, if all the kind of the cards fall for the right team, that you could get a midfielder getting a victory in this year at an odd race, which I think would be great. And then it could literally be any of them depending on the situation. I mean, it could be Haas or Williams, as much as it's more likely to be potentially McLaren. I think would probably be the favourite at the front midfield at the moment, but it would be good if we could get a few more non-top three team podiums, because I think that just makes the whole end of the race that's a bit slightly more interesting than the sort of the standard mix of people just getting up there every weekend.
Yeah, makes our prediction league more interesting as well.
Yeah, I think from last.
I mean, I think if you were a betting person or in a league, to put in the odd podium for a non-top top three driver, you probably could get some payouts on that. And you could do okay, I imagine.
Yeah, what odds did you get on a Perez World Championship?
1,000 to 1, I think it was.
I think that wouldn't probably be the ideal bet. I'll be honest with you.
I've concocted a dream, or at least a scenario.
Oh God.
The scenario is that Ferrari's off the pace. Red Bull haven't quite got it, and Honda still have problems. Mercedes end up with Bottas that's really coming at Hamilton, so they fall out with each other, and Perez becomes the Kimi Raikkonen of this year and sneaks the championship while Mercedes were losing it.
Brilliant.
Well, I'll watch the Drive to Survive episode.
I've got to be honest,
Yeah.
that sounds like a great season. Like, that sounds really entertaining to watch.
So I think basically what we're saying is that everyone else would be fighting in the pit lane, and Perez just kind of drives out when no one's looking. I think that's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
that's
Lance
the general
Stroll.
gist.
Lance Stroll is still 12th.
Yeah, except at Monza. Yeah,
And Baku.
races with no corners, he'll still beat Perez. But yeah, it could happen. Anything could happen in F1. But I do fear that the championship will go to the obvious contenders this year. I think the interest will be in who chases them and when. I think that really is going to be the kind of story this year, rather than anyone probably than a silver Mercedes winning with I was about to say a purple crash helmet, but I don't know if now the regulation has changed. That I imagine Hamilton's probably most drivers are going to change their crash helmet on virtually every race to play about with the liveries that they put on them. Make it even harder to spot who the driver is.
Yeah.
If only they had their own unique numbers on the car.
Yeah, visible from ahead and from the side. Yeah.
Do you not think Red Bull will be a challenge from like Australia?
I think Red Bull will be a challenge throughout the year. There is absolutely no question of it. They will be there. I just don't think Red Bull can put in a season-long performance that would be more consistent than Mercedes. And that's no outright criticism of Red Bull. I think that's just, I think where Mercedes are at in terms of where they got through last year, despite the pressures, they let some race wins go, but at the end of the year, they still absolutely blitz the championship. So I think it will be a lot closer this year. I don't think we're going to be getting to all things occurring as they are scheduled to. I don't think we'll be getting to 2/3 of the way through the championship and it will be over. I think it will become a bit more to the wire between those sort of top drivers. But again, I would find it hard to see someone being more consistent than Mercedes throughout the year. But I think we're going to have some absolutely ding-dong races and some on-track racing this year. I mean, it's really shaping up to be really exciting. So hopefully, you ignore the final constructors and drivers' positions and what they just enjoy the race in between each race.
I think that's the plan. One thing that I did want to bring up, going back to testing, was there were stories about the Renault having more of last year's car in than new parts. I don't know if you came across that one, because it seems to be a bit much of a hybrid.
I mean, that wouldn't be unusual for any team, to be honest. I mean, you as much as they all come out and say, "Oh, it's 100% new car," there's not a single part that gets carried over. That simply is never true, unless someone has literally rebuilt the car and gone complete to like imperial nuts and bolts rather than metric ones. Yeah, I mean, I've not seen too many detailed photographs of the Renault. What I've seen of it so far, it looks different enough in details to feel that they have done, stuff to the car. I think if you could cover bits of it over, you could then maybe struggle to think whether it's this year's car or last year's car. But I think that's the same for everybody. So again, Renault remains this team that is just a bit of an enigma in how aggressive it is in tackling Formula One. And you heard a bit of talk about that sort of during the launch phase, didn't you? And if you can call their launch a launch, which was rather odd this year as well, wasn't it? Yeah. I would hate to try and predict where Renault are going to end up this year. Last year they were looking good, but they obviously had a really bad year with their aero setup and with their tyre management. And maybe they've cured that over the winter. They've learnt their lesson from last year, or maybe they haven't. Maybe there'll be a different problem. It's really hard to predict. Again, the only thing I would say is at the moment we're not seeing that big step from Renault that would make them the clear leaders of the midfield. I think that moment, the gut feel isn't that's McLaren that are taking that kind of position. But again, you'll have to see how that shapes up through the year. But they're another one of those teams that perennially just seem to kind of like, no, this year we've got it sorted and we're ready for it. And then it's like by mid-season, it's like, oh no, we're fine. We'll leave it this year. We'll come back next year. Both on the chassis and the engine. I mean, they don't develop the engine through the year in the way that all the other three engine manufacturers do, to be frank. So we'll just have to sit and watch. Hopefully, they've got their formulas right over the winter and they can come out fighting in Melbourne. But we will literally have to wait and see how that quali and that first race session goes.
It's strange they don't even seem to hold themselves like a works team anymore. It's really odd.
Yeah, I think that's actually, you've hit the nail on the head there. They don't feel like a factory team. They still very much feel like Enstone, don't they? It's like, we've got a bit of money together this year. We're going to go racing. It doesn't feel like the might of Renault are saying we're going to go out there and kind of pulverise the opposition. I think, again, you then have to wonder is what is Renault's commitment to F1? And I think you could probably go up and down the grid and point that accusation at maybe a handful of teams now. Is what is their commitment to F1 long term? Because I think Mercedes, I predicted for many years will step out as a factory team at some point in the not too distant future, much to Mercedes Twitter accounts defiance. But I will always speculate, and I don't see anything that has given me any feeling that Mercedes are going to stay in the sport as a manufacturer entry longer term.
It's a strange thing though for Renault. If Renault haven't got like the backing that they're putting into the team, yet they then go and spend 40 million on Daniel Ricciardo.
Yeah, again, it's you scratch your head sometimes and look at these things and think, how did that happen? Where do you spend your money for the lap time? And then, no offense to Daniel, who is one of the best drivers out there, I don't know if Renault were in that position at that stage to need a star driver. I think there was an opportunity there and they grabbed it, but it's been a very expensive step for them. If anything, you just feel that they're maybe a step further away from it this year than they were at the start of last year in terms of optimism and kind of, steel to get stuck into the championship.
Do you think Formula One can be that petty that it was more of a case of getting one over on Red Bull and taking their other driver at that point, where Red Bull and Renault were falling out with each other?
Just when the engine announcement had happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you could be cynical and say that they did it that way. I would seriously doubt anyone would do it for those reasons. I think they saw an opportunity to get a top class driver, and felt that was the direction that they needed to go. I don't think it was done to spite Renault. I'm sure at the end of it there was probably a little, oh yeah, we did that, ha ha ha, and a pat on the back. But I don't think that. I mean, I think it was, on paper it did look like a good move if you were feeling very optimistic for your team. So yeah, I think it was opportunist rather than vindictive.
Worked out really well for Arrows when they got Damon Hill in the number one and that. Oh, hang on.
Got a podium.
Yeah, but then again, you say that, but he as he almost got that victory in for them for that year. Would another driver have been in that position? And the same when Jordan kind of nabbed him as well. Having a good driver sometimes can bring the change about in results that you've always sought. But I think Renault's problems obviously run far deeper than driving talent last year. And there was just simply nothing that Daniel could do, really, given the engine, reliability and the chassis performance and the tyre performance.
I think if anything, it highlights Renault's problems more, doesn't it? Because when you've got a guy which is a proven race winner and it's could possibly be a world champion at some point, and he's where he was all last year, it just doesn't look good for anybody.
No, it doesn't, and I don't think it's going to be much better for them this year because obviously Ocon's so highly rated that they've got nowhere to hide with their package, have they? Really, with those drivers on board, they've really got to deliver. And they've really only got this year to do it, I would imagine, given the contracts that are in place. I'm not quite sure exactly where they are, but I think they're quite short, aren't they?
From the comfort of my armchair, I've never understood why Ocon is so highly rated. Because all I remember him doing when he was in Force India was having little clattery moments with Perez, taking out Max Verstappen when Max Verstappen should have won a race, and constantly arguing with people. I don't understand how a year out of motorsport will help that.
Yeah, I mean, I as you probably know, my background's technical. I find it very hard to rate the drivers. He's a very nice guy. I've met him, and he put some good performances against Perez. They're two very different types of driver. So I think people do see him as a slightly more exciting, get stuck in driver compared with Perez, who obviously has his way of approaching races, which has been massively successful for him in Racing Point, Force India over the years. But I mean, like you, I don't feel that he is the next big thing. I think if in the right place at the right time, he could win championships and races, certainly. But again, he is a really good, well-known quantity, and he's sat in that Renault now. So for Renault, it's kind of put up or shut up, isn't it, really?
But I think the reason that everyone looks at Renault with such cynicism is the number of times they've pulled out as a constructor, as an engine supplier, and you just think, oh, they're going to do it again. It's another Renault exit. 3 years, they'll be back in one form or another.
Yep.
And last year they got a little bit embarrassed when their engine in a customer team was outperforming their own cars. And I think this is why, like you say, Lee, they're not like a factory team. Just because they should be the best performing car with a Renault engine in it.
I'm now forever going to call this Rexit as well.
Well, I don't know whether being French, it's more of au revoir.
Yeah, it's you just don't get that feeling that they are going to suddenly start winning races just on performance alone. They've changed their technical structure slightly, losing Nick Chester, gaining Pat Fry. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a silver bullet for them to make big changes. And in some respects, I wonder, should the Enstone team be an independent? Let's just have let them have at it as an independent with the Renault engine, find some money from somewhere and go that way. I think they would, in some respects, they potentially could be a better team, like they were when they were kind of that sort of odd Lotus entry for a few years, where it really allowed them to be that little agile team that they have always been, as Benetton and whatever else over the years, and go racing that way. I don't know if Renault Enstone F1 is necessarily the right way for them to go racing.
Until they enter a third car with Nelson Piquet Jr. driving it.
Yes, well, that's a different story, isn't it? Yeah.
We've sort of touched on McLaren a little bit. Have you seen anything on this year's car that sort of keeps up the progression from last year?
I mean, McLaren are one of the teams, like a lot of the side of the midfield, which have kind of just done a little bit more to their car, and nothing big and weird like on the Mercedes, on the Red Bull, sort of big ideas, but just made a little step with all the little details. There's nothing on there that particularly I kind of sort of picked out, but that's no bad thing. They really had the kind of the pace at the back end of last year. If the Renault engine can push them along a bit better and a bit more reliability as well, then I think they're on for their best season in a long time. And with the potential of Ferrari sort of wobbling around a bit, I think there's a real potential for them to really get kind of stuck in at the beginning of the season. Whether they can hold out through the whole season against Ferrari, maybe not. It depends how much kind of Maranello kind of implodes, really, because it can go either way with them, can't it? But yeah, so I mean, everything there is looking really good. Great driver lineup, nice mix of sort of skills between the two of them, and I think we saw sort of Sainz really come out as that sort of quite professional, sticky driver that we did see sort of glimpses of sort of through his Red Bull years. So I think things are looking pretty good there. They've really got a good setup, and they've much of my criticism over the years, I think they have kind of reached the stage now where they are again a really serious F1 team.
I mean, that's good to see, because we've talked at length about their years in the doldrums, but how much of that was Honda's fault? How much of that was Ron Dennis's fault?
No,
yeah,
but
I mean, I think there's been a lot of fault in lots of places over those years, and I think a lot of it comes down to the kind of the core at McLaren. You can blame Honda, but I think a lot of that was mismanagement by McLaren, and I think it's took them a while to see that and to work those things through. They will be going back to Mercedes power, won't they, in the future? So that is like this could get interesting. So I mean, I think the Renault is a slight thorn in their heel, so to speak. So again, I mean, you look at how things could be panning out in the future. Things are looking quite good for McLaren. So applause to them and a pat on the back that they have done the job, which so many of us doubted that they could get to. Just a couple of years ago.
at the time when McLaren got the Mercedes engines for next year, I thought about what you were saying, not what you're saying just before, but I thought about that same thing about Mercedes leaving Formula One. Mm-hmm. And what a good position it puts Mercedes in, because they could pull out of Formula One as a constructor now and still have their McLaren Mercedes favoured team like they used to.
Yeah, I think though if that were to happen, I think that we've got to start calling all teams by their factory town now, haven't we? The Brackley team could find itself kind of continued in a kind of a Braun-esque way, and we could potentially I would imagine something like Wolf F1.
I'm going to say it's going to be the second team on the grid to be called Wolf Racing.
Yes. So I think that we would see a continuation of the Brackley operation under somebody else's title as a Mercedes engined independent team, and I still have a really strong level of success. So that's how I would see that would pan out on that side. And so much the better for McLaren if if they're back on top of their game, then you could see Mercedes customer teams fighting out for the championship. Wolf versus McLaren again, going back to
worst series on National Geographic.
Remember the WR1? So I think that, as much as I think it could be. A lot of teams could be under threat. I think the potential rebirth of the teams still gives us, some hope that we will see an exciting Formula One in the years ahead.
I always wondered whether Ferrari would think back to when they started the Schumacher era, and how did we do that? Well, we bought the best bits of Benetton, and whether they'd make a smash and grab for, say, Lewis Hamilton and key members of Mercedes in one swoop.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a possibility. That's how lots of teams, make that big step ahead. Obviously, the trouble with Ferrari is they've done that so many times in the past, and so often they've actually done that wrong. If you actually consider that Mercedes under the past few years have been with James Allison, Ferrari had him They had him. He was their technical, and they squandered that opportunity and mismanaged the whole situation. And all the political background at Ferrari at the time undermined what James was doing there. So it's not always the silver bullet just to buy in some big names. And equally, I would wonder how much Lewis wants to carry on in F1. I know he's obviously quite emotional about potentially racing for Ferrari, but equally he's got lots of other interests and other motivations. So it could happen. I think it's just as likely that it's unlikely to. They could hire Newey. I can't see that really happening.
Hasn't he got some sort of golden handcuff deal though with Red Bull where he can't work for another team?
I'm not sure about that. I think Ferrari would happily buy him out if they could.
Yeah.
Again, you have to question who has got the motivation to do that. I think there's quite a few key people that Ferrari would do really well to employ from other teams that would work really well. But it only works if that is the big direction that the whole of the Maranello sort of Politico wants to go in. And I think at the moment, I think we've got to be a bit worried about the direction that Ferrari is going, and is it all going to go a bit pear-shaped this year? Because you can see that Binotto is under a lot of pressure, and I think he's shouldered some of the blame for issues last year, rightly or wrongly. I'm not quite sure, but Ferrari potentially could be looking for some senior staff quite rapidly, judging from past experience.
Well, haven't they already said that if this year's car isn't quick out of the blocks, then they're going to abandon it early? So
I think they've said that, and again, the kind of the rumble and the whisper from inside Maranello is this car is not going to be at the level they want it to be, either on chassis or engine. But a disorganized team scrapping this year's car to go and look at next year's car isn't necessarily a recipe for success in 2021. So, again, it's a case of the management need to be all go in the right direction, and I'm not sure if Ferrari, after a bad start to the year, are going to be in a position to comfortably say, "Oh, we're going to forget about this. We don't mind coming behind McLaren in the championship and fourth, but we're going to be great next year." I don't think they could take that position, and I think heads will roll very rapidly.
I'm going to say the Ferrari way of doing things is if we're not doing well, even though we're not good enough to do well, we'll still fire people.
Well, you just get the feeling, don't you, with Ferrari, since you had Jean Todt and Ross Brawn in the house, no one else has been trusted with the keys since those two. There's always been like an overshadowing voice waiting to sack someone.
Yeah, which is if you look through history, sadly the Ferrari way. And it's only when they get a really steady pair of hands do things get sorted at the team. And that there was that period where they did have harmony with the Todd, Brawn, Byrne, Schumacher era. But even at the end of that then started to kind of peel apart, didn't it? And there were accusations, and they wanted to get rid of people before everyone actually started to leave. So yeah, it's an odd facet of Ferrari's character, isn't it?
Politics over engineering any day for them.
Yes, yeah, that seems to be the general gist of it. And you sit there and think, who could come in and really nail that team manager and that technical director position where you would bring direction and harmony to the team, and while keeping the big boss happy. We've not had many phases of that over the past few years, sadly.
Yeah, many have tried, not many have succeeded. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about was this one's confused me a great deal. AlphaTauri, obviously part of the Red Bull group, saying they've now got closer ties with Red Bull technology. How can they be closer than they were before?
It's weird. If you if you had two F1 teams, the greatest designer in current Formula One, and you wanted them both to be really successful, you would run them almost as a single entity, wouldn't you? That's the way I would see how you would run it. But if you look at Toro Rosso throughout its history, which obviously is adding up to quite a few years now. I mean, I still think of them as a newish team, but obviously, they were up to their 16th year must be now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Crazy.
And throughout most of that, only tapering off in the last sort of year or so, they have been almost wholly independent of Red Bull in design terms. And you scratch your head and you used to look at them and go, why are they designing their own gearbox? Red Bull have got a perfectly good gearbox they could just buy. And then when you see the listed parts approach that is increasingly becoming popular, that's why wasn't that a direction taken much earlier? And it's only now that they're reaching that. So last year they took the gearbox, the whole gearbox and rear suspension for the first time. This year they're getting the front suspension to match it from last year's car, if I remember correctly. So they've taken a slightly bigger step towards not a full Haas version of it, but certainly being a bit more pragmatic in where they spend their money. And I think that's a good thing. You could then argue, well, that means that they will always only ever be slower than the Red Bull team. But, well, come on, let's be honest. They weren't a threat to Red Bull for these past 15, 16 years. Simply taking year-old equipment will just bring them closer, but not to the level where they would overtake them on a regular basis. So it seems entirely right and pragmatic and long overdue that this approach has been taken. Obviously, it's slightly sad for the engineering group at Faenza at AlphaTauri. I struggle to remember that at the moment. Doesn't roll off the tongue just yet. It's not even an easy thing to kind of remember or pronounce. But
We've rechristened them Team T-shirt.
yeah, that's probably slightly better. So, I mean, obviously that was a factor in James Key deciding to sort of depart the team, that he didn't have that sort of full control and full trust of the Red Bull technology group. But, yeah, I mean, I think that's the right direction. And, again, this year, where will they end up? Because there was points last year, they looked really good, and other points when they looked kind of nowhere, really. And I think it has been their inconsistency has been the most troubling thing of the Toro Rosso Faenza team, as we could call it, because
Faenza, yeah.
the Faenza team, the repeated team name changes. So I think this year, all I would really want from them is them just to be like a solid position in the championship and at races throughout. So they're always maybe qualifying either just in or just out of the top 10, and that they're going to finish a nice solid sixth or something, rather than one weekend thinking they're going to drop right down, and then other weekends thinking, wow, they're on it. And obviously, Brazil last year, where it was like, oh my God, it outdragged Hamilton on the straight on the last lap. So that there is potential in that team, but the consistency strikes me as a thing that's always kind of let them down.
It's gonna be a tough one to call. I think that just leaves Alfa Romeo that we've not really talked about. And
Yep.
they were a little bit anonymous during testing, really.
Yeah, I mean, again, they had, but much like their performance through last year, there were moments where they had flashes of speed and moments when there wasn't. So you sort of scratch your head and think, where does that leave them? And they are one of the factory group teams, but they have lost their designer, who's gone, Simone Aresta, who's gone back to Ferrari. That will be an issue for them. Maybe not initially, but maybe as the year progresses. The car, seems as good as it was last year. And again, it's just that kind of inconsistency. We know that if Raikkonen's in the right mood with the right car and the right tyres, that on race day he can pull out what, if he was a rookie, what you would describe as miracles, but you accept it when Kimi kind of suddenly pulls in a sixth position in a race. So yeah, I mean, I think their race performance could actually outshine, particularly in Kimi's hands, outshine the car's general performance. But yeah, I mean, I think that you would have to accept that there are stronger midfield teams this year, and things don't look particularly rosy for Alfa Romeo, but
The
you know,
Hinwil team.
yes. So yeah, so I mean, I think their strength is in the potential pace and the potential performance of Kimi, really. But you would have to say that a position above seventh or would be unlikely in the championship. But there'll be weekends where they'll just get it all together and just really nail a great race result.
Do you think that Alfa Romeo, as they are now, are gradually coming into more of a position as the Ferrari junior team and taking over from Haas? Because obviously with Fiat Chrysler Group putting the money into title sponsorship of it and the Sauber name sort of gradually being phased out, are they now becoming sort of the new, what we thought Haas were going to be, with getting the, I won't say the
Yeah,
Ferrari offcasts, but
I think certainly commercially it's looking that way. Technically, no, because they still are very much an independent team, merely running the Ferrari engine and gearbox. So they still, that as far as I understand, they don't take anything from Ferrari apart from that. So if Haas were to pull out, there is the potential that they could be potentially coerced that direction. But the Hinwil team, as we must call them now, again, they're a bit like Williams. They are staunchly independent. There is that, stuck out. I say stuck out. That's not a rather impolite way of putting it, but based out quite remotely from the rest of the F1 sort of centres in Switzerland. That we do our own thing. You look at the car and you can see it is significantly different from most other cars on the grid in lots of details. It's by no means a copy of anybody else's. I would find it might be quite a difficult pill for them to swallow. But then again, Freddie Vasseur running the team is very pragmatic, and if that's what brings the results in the lap times, then I think he would, potentially lose some of the design skills now to take Ferrari parts. So
Maranello team.
Yeah, from the Maranello team, which have been, in fairness, have been very consistent with their team name over the years.
Yes.
In contrast to just everybody else, I think, actually. So I mean, it's always nice to see one of those kind of minnows have a bit of a result, but I don't think you could be too confident for them this year. But finally, I think the team we've spoken least about actually is Red Bull, which potentially is the
true.
is the fly in the ointment, or the potential excitement for the year, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, because I mean they were showing pace and reliability in longer stretches during testing. The car looks fast when it goes out on a hot lap, and I did see quite a bit of sandbagging from Max Verstappen, two absolutely blistering sectors, and then just taking his foot off the gas for sector 3 because he knew he'd already got it. But obviously, the way that Barcelona's laid out, first 2 sectors, long turns, long straights, and then the third a little bit more technical, or as Lee described it, the twisty turny bit that twists and turns.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. I think Honda have come on leaps and bounds, and I think Honda will continue to do so. And I think that could be the big threat for Mercedes this year, how well that goes. And then with a reliable, powerful engine, Red Bull can then unleash the chassis, which they've been obviously having to kind of ease back in terms of how much downforce they can afford to run, because of the lack of power. So they are looking really threatening. Of course, we've said this about lots of teams over the past that have potentially threatened Mercedes through winter testing, and as a result of previous year's success, and then bang, you hit Melbourne and Merck just stick it in another gear and like pull away. I think that might be slightly more difficult for Merck this year, but I think the thing that will start to shake out will be not the outright pace of the car. So I think qualifying in some respects will become slightly less important this year, because potentially it's going to be how you manage the tyres and your race strategy that actually brings you the victory, rather than who can literally pull out the fastest ever lap on a single lap, and it will come down to racecraft, and that shakes out to be really interesting. And I think last year, for all of the criticism of it being a kind of a bit of a murk whitewash in the championship, we saw probably more on track action last year than I can remember for many years. And the drivers being quite prepared to really go wheel to wheel and beyond. And yeah, that really makes it for a massively exciting race. And I think, Red Bull clearly have got a bit of a star in Max Verstappen. And I think the challenge for them in championship, certainly for the constructors, will be how much Albon can pick himself up by the bootlaces and tag on to the back of the group of what potentially 5 other very good drivers in the top three teams.
Has there been anything on the Red Bull that's caught your eye? Because I remember reading before the testing started that someone was saying that Red Bull were kind of told just to throw everything at the car and take risks with it to try and find the performance.
Yeah, I mean, the Red Bull actually is one of those kind of quietly adventurous cars, and I think a lot of people have looked at it and kind of misunderstood it slightly. So they've worked very hard on that car this year. You can see it, and you can see where they've decided not to make compromises, like with the front suspension, in terms of its part of its geometry. But then in other areas, you can see where they're really pushing some areas. So you've got the slim nose, which I think everyone picked up on. But then you have this whole, what they call it, a double bulkhead set up at the front, which has been variously described in various, in my opinion, quite inaccurate ways in various places, and is actually quite interesting in what they've done to the car. And the more you kind of work out what the rationale is, the more you actually realise that I think they've got maybe one of the more way over what DAS potentially could do. They've actually got one of the quite interesting layouts of the season on their car. So what they've actually done is move the front suspension on the front axle line effectively forwards on the car, and this has done 2 things. This, first of all, it gives you a slight change in wheelbase, which I think they've counteracted at the back slightly. But what this does is gives you more space for barge boards, which obviously are the kind of the key differentiator between all of the aero parts on the cars. But what it also does is allow them to play with the front suspension in the way that no one else has been able to. So when we were talking about DAS earlier, I was talking about Ackermann geometry and how you get the wheels to steer through a corner at a slightly different rate from your inside wheel to your outside wheel. And with the way that they're now changing front ride height with the push rod set up on these cars, as we saw at Monaco last year, where I think it was Bottas on the onboard, you saw him turn the steering wheel and the whole front of the car just dropped down to the floor. I think Red Bull have got a bit of a trick there because they've moved the steering rack actually behind the front axle line. And again, it's very difficult to do without waving my hands in the air. But
We're going to have to get you on video one of these shows.
oh well, yeah. I'm going to have to do a sort of a kind of a David Bellamy waving my hands in the air explanation of things. But what this potentially allows Red Bull to do, apart from giving them an aero advantage with the barge boards, is if they can play about with the geometry of the steering, they can really gain a lot of downforce through the corners by lowering the front of the car. And with their already really high rake at the back of the car, this potentially could give them a huge advantage in downforce and how they can play with the balance of the car at different tracks. And no one else has really kind of picked up on this fact. In fact, a lot of people actually thought they'd moved the suspension forwards because of the way it gets laid out at the front. It's what they've had to do is very structural. No one can copy this through a season, whereas someone potentially could redesign their steering rack and run DAS on a conventional car. No one, without building a completely new monocoque, can copy what Red Bull have done around the front of this car this year. So they've been quite clever about it, and it's really kind of gone under the radar. Hopefully it will get talked about a lot more as I get around to drawing it properly, and people actually start to understand what's going on there. So yeah, that Red Bull is good. It's like it's using some new ideas, keeping the best of the old ideas, and obviously Honda just keep ploughing on as they do. I mean, a lot of people were actually placing the Honda engine, on a par with the Mercedes by the back end of last year, which is comes a long way from 2015 when, they were just literally going through engines every weekend and every session. So, I think any success this year for them is deserved. And potentially, potentially there is a championship there for them. I think that is a bit of a stretch for them, but it's a complete possibility.
That would that would be interesting to see.
I think Verstappen's going to be the driver who will take it to Hamilton more than any other.
Yeah, I agree.
He'll be
I
one to keep an
think,
eye on. Yeah.
if you were to try and create a season average podium, it would probably be something along the lines of Hamilton, Verstappen, and somebody else.
Yeah.
We had some Vettel, Leclerc, Albon, Bottas, all fighting. So I think it will be a Hamilton Verstappen championship this year.
Yeah.
Which will be exciting on track. I think it will push the championship towards the end of the season, and it could be someone other than Hamilton that wins. It could be Verstappen that wins it this year. I think the constructors, I think Mercedes have to be really unlucky not to clinch it this year, because I can see no way that Red Bull can have the two-car consistency, or Ferrari can have the pace to beat them in that. And if we ended up with a Verstappen drivers and a Mercedes constructors, I think we'd all be quite happy with that, wouldn't we?
We haven't really seen Verstappen.
Hamilton was listening. Sorry, I know you won't be, but
we haven't really seen Verstappen sort of with the pressure of a car which is capable of doing something. He's always been the guy that could get the one good result where Red Bull turned up, and somewhere it feels easy to do that because you're always just going to get lauded with the praise, aren't you? Without the pressure.
Yeah. I mean, I think he can probably, and I think certainly the way the team will spin it to the media, and certainly spin it to Max himself, is that, you can't beat Mercedes in the current formula, so we might as well throw everything at it. And if you crash, fine, and have that level of approach. And I think up to a point this year, I think that can actually work for Verstappen's mentality. But I think there will come a point when he will then have to put the mature head on, which we've seen growing over these years. Maybe slower than sometimes we'd like it to have gone, but
he's still 12, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's when it will come down to those last couple of races where he has to get those results in, when maybe they're not quite going his way. I think that's when we'll actually see whether he has got that, mature world champion mentality underneath him. I think potentially the first championship may come from that throwaway mentality. The second one, particularly with the Red Bull advantage, could be the more difficult one for him, where he has to be have that world champion mentality and think, I've got to shape my whole season to get to this end goal. I think this year it will be go for it, and if we don't make it, we're always going to get second or third, so that's great. So yeah, I mean, I hopefully, the Helmut Marko, Christian Horner kind of mind games that can work, good or bad for a driver, will work positively for Max this year, and kind of free him up to just drive until it comes down to that kind of crunch point, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that's impressed me with Lewis Hamilton over the last couple of years, was just since he seems to have set his sights on beating Schumacher's record, he's been relentless. If he has a bad race, or if he was beaten by his teammate, where when it was Rosberg he'd seem rattled or bothered about it, he just seems to take it now because he knows like another win is probably only 2 weeks away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Hamilton with Mercedes, and I think it's very important that you put the two together, particularly with Peter Bonington as race engineer, and with the whole strategy set up in Mercedes and the way they engineered the car, is that they've worked out how to get victories when they can. And I think last year was the great example. A few years ago, you would have said that maybe Mercedes weren't the greatest strategic team out there because they had a strategic opportunities. Oh, you still there?
Yep.
Yeah.
I thought we'd lost you for a second there.
I heard the worries for a second. I thought they were gone. So I think they, in a very similar way that you see Perez and Force India Racing Point have found their way of racing. I think Hamilton, with his potentially blistering consistent pace, and also his great tyre management, which I think is one of his big unsung kind of skills. They've really found a way of actually managing this. And last year, it was absolutely testament to that. So again, I think they may take a similar approach this year, where it's like, some weekends it's not worth having a battle with Max. We're quite happy to slip in behind him. But again, there will always come that crunch point when you can't afford to do that in the championship or in a situation. So I think we'll have a few times where people will tactically kind of back away, and a few times where they will just lock horns. And I think that's going to makes for a fantastic season.
Well, it all kicks off this weekend in Australia. Fingers crossed, while touching wood. I still think it will go ahead because, or something will happen in Australia this weekend, because there's too many teams and too many personnel and too many parts there not to
they're already
not to
there.
run something. So, because Australia isn't one of those circuits you can just rock up to 3 days before the race, because you've got to get acclimatised to the time difference for starters.
Mm-hmm.
So, as it's the start of a new season, that means the predictions are running again.
Oh no, I'd forgotten about this.
Yes. And I'm sorry to say, Craig, we did this to you last year, because we always have a guest predictor, and this week it's going to be you.
Okay, was it for the race?
For the race, for the top
race?
three.
Top three. Okay, well, I'll stand by my season average concept. So it'll be Hamilton from Verstappen, and I think it will be Bottas following him up this weekend. Very boring prediction, but I think if I was putting money on a safe bet, that's exactly where I put it this weekend.
Right. Who fancies going next?
Verstappen, Hamilton, Carlos Sainz.
Wow.
Gee.
I'm just
noting
watching
these down.
Paul trying to type Lee's three-letter name correctly.
It's not easy typing with this splint on.
Yeah, but how did you get the 7 in there?
It's the second E that's the tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, spelt with the silent 7.
I'm going to type one-handed, it'll be a lot easier. Right.
I will go. I will go for Bottas,
Yeah.
Hamilton,
Yeah.
Verstappen.
Okay. Chris?
And I'm so boring. I'm just going to go Hamilton, Bottas, Verstappen.
So no love for Ferrari today, then.
Not in
Not
Australia.
yet.
Just don't think
Paul's,
they've got
coming
it
now.
got it at the minute, but I
I think they're still going to be in the airport. That's why.
I am going for
What chance
Bottas,
is
Verstappen, Hamilton. Right, I will get those on the website. If any of the listeners want to do their own predictions, we've got the prediction league running. Just go to 3Legs4Wheels.com, go to the game section, and it's the 2020 predictions, and you get to predict top 3, fastest lap, pole position, and number of DNFs this season.
Okay.
New for 2020.
New for 2020, and of course, one race out of the year you can double your points. Just to make it a bit more exciting and see if we can take it down to the wire.
Should we do like football, where if you have a DNF at your home race, it counts as 2?
I'm not
What
pro.
if there's only one race?
Oh no, they were all secret, held behind closed doors, and not televised. Yeah, we've got that to look forward to in a couple of weeks' time. As always, I will be live blogging the race on Sunday. Chris will be with me, and
be.
Sean as well.
I'll be there.
And if we can, if
I'll be there.
I don't know how involved I'll be, but I'll be
yeah,
there.
you'll be there. It's in our house. You
Yeah.
probably will have to be there. And we'll see if we can coax Dan out of retirement at some point of the year.
Yes.
Well, not retirement, but wedding planning.
Sabbatical.
That's his cover story.
Retirement. Let's stick with retirement.
Probably not got time for a total shunt this week, have we? Because
No.
It's getting on a bit.
it's yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Craig.
No, pleasure as always. Great fun. Thank you very much, everyone.
It's always great to have you on. Just a quick reminder, Formula Lee is running until next Monday. This race is a racing point in the dry in Melbourne, and get your times in the usual ways. You can find them all on the website. And massive thanks, as always, to all our Patreon supporters.
Absolutely. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
You can find out what that is by going to patreon.com/3legs4wheels.
I am sinking.
You are
Oh,
you are
you
sinking.
This is why we need Patreons, because clearly we need a new chair.
Yeah, this chair is sinking.
Chris is now about a foot shorter than he was at the start of the podcast.
I have been on that chair before, and I feel it's very judgmental.
Well, yeah. I do feel like I've been judged.
We need less biscuits, fewer biscuits as a podcast.
And if you want to get in touch, we are at 3Legs4Wheels on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And between us, all the rest of us are
I'm at a total shunt.
At Flood21.
At Sean Kelper.
at Pablo100. And Craig, your Twitter handle is?
At Scarbstech.
There you go. Right, we'll be back next week, and hopefully we will have a race to talk about
Let's
and
hope so.
review. Fingers crossed. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stopped it. Yep. We are still live on YouTube, so nobody swear too much.
That's not a usual rule.
No, that's we're trying to be polite.
So yeah, thanks very much again for that, Craig. It's always awesome having you on and getting your insight into certain things, especially at pivotal points of the year, like the start of the season.
Yeah, because
Oh,
at
no,
this point
thank-
we
thank
don't know
you.
what we're on about, really, do we? Let's be honest.
No.
It's quite helpful.
Oh, well, we've got very little to base on. We've got 6 days of testing. Is kind of nothing at all. It's not even worth kind of talking about the times, is it? So,
No.
yeah.
And what is
Yeah,
it now?
it'll be
No testing this year till Hungary because
Yeah.
they got rid of the Barcelona and Bahrain tests.
Oh, of course, I forgot about that. So what you don't want to be is a rookie in 2021 because you're going to have no track time, are you?
No.
Well, what is you get an extra super license point this year for every Friday session you take part in, up to a maximum of 10. So I reckon we'll see a lot of young drivers on Friday mornings.
Yeah. I should let them out on like Sunday morning, have a little something. I don't know.
Yeah, give,
Yeah.
give them a
Reserve-
shakedown.
reserve
Give them a
driver.
shakedown.
Yeah.
Bring the old warm up
Session
back.
in the morning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'll put
I
the
haven't-
value up, won't it? The value of the seats. You know, when Formula One teams allow someone to come in for a Friday test,
Yeah.
they'll be able to charge more for doing it, won't they?
I mean, what was it? Julian Palmer was paying 100,000 per Friday
Something like that.
FP1.
Yeah.
Really?
Something like
That
that.
seems incredibly good value, doesn't it?
That's actually.
Do you think these people are spending millions of pounds to go out into space for like 3 minutes on the Virgin thing? For 100 grand, you could get a free practice session in a Formula One car.
Yeah, but don't forget it was a 2015
That's not-
Renault, so
that's
it
not
didn't
saying-
actually work.
Someone put a comment on Sophia Flosch's Instagram last year about why she wasn't doing more testing, and she actually put down like the individual cost of every single session. I feel like I'm getting drowned out by Lee's computer noises here.
Yeah.
But she put like a breakdown of how much everything is, and it's something like 30,000 euros for a private test in an F3 car. It's stupidly pricey.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Craig, I've got one question that I think was possibly even slightly too geeky for the podcast, which we'll keep this on the special for the guys who are still watching on the YouTube video.
Mhm.
I heard, I don't know if you've had a chance yet to stand close to the Ferrari, or you will at some point during the season, I'm sure. But when the Ferrari fires up and it's idling, it sounds an awful lot more burbly than the other V6s do that said they seem to run a lot smoother.
Technical term there.
Have Ferrari changed the firing order of their cylinders on the ICE in order to get more low torque power rather than high end top speed?
I haven't heard that theory, so I'm going to think about that out loud as we go along.
Are they allowed to for a start?
Yes, yep. Firing order is free, but anything change on a 90-degree V6 is going to start to introduce a lot of vibration. So you would have to think really carefully about why you would do that. I think one of the things I've always picked up from being in the pit lane or trackside is how different will the engines sound in different situations. So I always used to think that Ferrari did always sound a lot more burbly, whereas the Renault sounded almost slightly asthmatic because of the amount of blowing you could hear from the turbo, and the Mercedes was somewhere in between, and then the Honda just sounded like it just wasn't running properly at all. So yeah, they all do have quite individual sounds anyway, and I think it's very hard to kind of without having proper measuring equipment to kind of deduce too much from what your ear is hearing. Certainly, if you've got anything recorded, I wouldn't trust the sounds from the recordings at all, unless it's
Yeah.
like really, really high quality, and I don't think any of us get access to that. So I would initially be skeptical that they'd have done something, just because they all sound different. They actually even smell different as well, but that gets to a completely different level of geekery, and I'm not going to bother you with that just today. So yeah, let's just think then. If they change the firing order on a 6-cylinder, what would they be doing? They could be trying to get cylinders to run fire at the same time, which would you describe as a big bang engine, particularly in MotoGP terms, which kind of does limit maximum power you can get, but does tend to give you slightly better traction.
That's what I was thinking. They may possibly have done, but
Yeah, I mean that's a theory. I would have thought if that had happened, lots of other people would have picked up on that, and it would be quite obvious by now. So
my source is the Ferrari Twitter account when they put up the sound of the Ferrari starting up for the first time. It to me, it's, and I'm not like I'm very far from an expert. Of course, I'm an armchair F1 fan who does a podcast on a Monday night. But to me,
And a race blog on a Sunday.
And a race blog on a Sunday.
Yeah.
But to me, it sounded a lot different, and having a very little knowledge of engines and firing orders, I thought that sounds like they've changed the firing order of the.
I think I remember. I did remember hearing that. And what you actually find is when they slow crank an engine and get it running, it's a very different noise when the engine's being cranked over and fired in a pit garage or obviously a factory in that situation, to what it sounds like when it's actually on track. And it's actually a bit weird actually, because you hear it and you think, wow, is that what the engine actually sounds like when you first hear it? Because it's a lot more mechanical noise. The engine sounds a lot deeper. But when they're on track, obviously they're constantly running at much higher RPM, so you tend to hear much more of the screaming than those deeper noises. So I think anything that people have picked up from that is more from hearing it at a different time or for a different type of recording rather than hearing it out on track. Because I would be deeply skeptical that they've changed something substantial like that this year. But I won't I'm not going to get a chance to hear it for quite a while, unfortunately.
Fair enough.
If it's all this year, the way things are going. So I think it could just be that people, your ear is distracted by the level of sound recordings and the situation that the engine's in, rather than that they've done something dramatic with the firing order or the crank order of the engine.
DS Queenie says, I have access to that. I work at a camera hire house. We have some really high quality microphones, so we just need to find a way of getting you into the Ferrari garage when they're firing the engine.
There you go.
That feels like the difficult part.
Before the race start, I could just walk down the grid and just stick some microphones on the back of the cars. It's, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly no sound expert when it comes to recordings, but I know that lots of people suddenly pick up something. I think someone was talking about how the Ferrari changed between one particular gear. There was an odd noise, and I think it is kind of almost like the sampling rate of the microphones or something. Again, please excuse me, I'm not an expert in this area.
No.
But you just get some weird artifact into the sound that isn't actually there when you're trackside.
3 musicians and a radio journalist, none of us are experts on sound either.
Sampling rate has a ridiculous effect. To be fair, sampling rate is ridiculous. We record at work usually at about 41,000, and if it goes up slightly, you get so much clicking that probably would sound like something like a.
You get T sounds where there are no T sounds.
Yes.
Yeah. So sadly, you have to either be at the track with some of this kind of super clever stuff that they use to actually record the RPM notes and stuff, or just use it with your bare ear. But as I say, the Ferrari has typically had a much deeper exhaust note anyway to the other cars. So, yeah.
Something out of nothing, probably.
Possibly. But yeah, we'll all keep an ear out for it and see if something does develop out of that. You never know. Often you'll hear people come up with the most what may initially sound most ridiculous ideas that often turn out to be the real thing. So when I was first told that someone was changing the speed of the car with their knee, I thought that's rubbish.
You know what's going to happen, don't you? Sunday, first Ted's notebook of the season. It'll be there in the pit lane after the race. Anyone notice a different note to the Ferrari engine? You'll be leaping up and down.
I will. I will.
Yeah.
Right, it is knocking on. It is 11:10. Cheers again, Craig. Can't thank you enough for coming
No,
on.
my pleasure. It's always good fun. Always tricky questions.
Sorry.
It's hard to answer idiots sometimes.
If you're not being tested, then you're not thinking hard enough, are you? So that's great. Thank you.
That is brilliant. Thanks to everyone on YouTube that stuck around, and the audio should be coming out at some point tomorrow. Craig, I'll send you a link to the webpage when we put it up, so if you can tweet that out. Right, everyone. We'll be back. We'll be doing another podcast next week, come what may.
Yep.
God knows what's going to be.
Regardless of virus.
We'll be doing another podcast in May.
Oh, it might turn into a apocalypse prep podcast by next week.
That was the Patreon show. Right, we will see you all later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.